Hello everybody, Onesie Angelique here, Gare, and I have a question for you for this video, and I will be focusing on hopefully a short video on my answer to it, but the question being, what is the book that you have read more times than any other book, and why? Why that particular book? What is it about it that keeps you coming back to it? And how many times have you read it? If you know, doesn't matter if it's fiction, nonfiction, whatever. Why that particular book, and how many times have you read it? My answer to this is Anne Rice's 1997 novel, Violin. And as some of you may be aware, Anne is a extremely good friend of mine, and I'm very happy to say. And I've been a fan of hers since the 1970s when I first read Interview with the Vampire. A couple of things to say about Violin in particular. Not only is it the book that I've read more times than any other, it's also my favorite Anne Rice book, which I think surprises some people. I think if you ask a lot of people, they will assume that you would name one of the Vampire Chronicles or the Witching Hour or perhaps one of the Wolfgift books, but mine is Violin, and I don't know exactly how many times I've read it. I think probably, I know when it first came out, I read it at least 4 times in that first year that I had it. And I've read it regularly every 2 or 3 years since then. So I would say probably, and that's been going on 21 years. This came out in October of 1997. And I have various copies of this. This is not my original copy of it. And I've talked about this in other videos, a lot of my books are packed away right now because I'm doing a big reorganizing and sorting through things, and eventually I'm going to have them alphabetized and codified in such a way that they'll be much easier to sort through. But I have several copies, several editions of Violin. This particular, well, and several of them are signed. This particular edition is signed and inscribed by Anne, and this is going to be backwards probably, but she says, "To Gary Swafford, blessings, Anne Rice, 1998." And that's her inscription. And my original copy is quite a mess. It is ragged. It is dog-eared to pieces. It is underlined throughout. It's pretty much a mess. But I love this picture of Anne on the back. This is Anne at the gate of her famous First Street house, 1239 First Street, in the Garden District of New Orleans. Great picture of her. It looks like she's wearing a feather boa at the great iron gate of her house. Anyway, Anne calls this one of her orphan books. I guess meaning that it might not be the first book that you think of when you one of the first books you think of. Anne's written 30-something books, and it might not be one of the first books that you think of when you think of Anne Rice, but it's my favorite because I find the main characters of it utterly enthralling, compelling, devastatingly moving, unforgettable. Triana is a middle-aged woman living in New Orleans in the 1990s. She has just lost her second husband to AIDS, and she is basically prostrate with grief down below. I think when the book opens, if I remember correctly, she's lying on the kitchen floor, listening to Beethoven over and over and over, eating bread, just basically paralyzed with grief, and his body is still upstairs. It hasn't been taken away, and it's not discovered for a few days. Um, so she's very deep in depression and in grief, and she is visited upon by the ghost Stefan, who has a Stradivarius. And Trina is struggling with events that have happened in her life. She lost a child in a previous marriage with her first husband. She's just lost this husband to AIDS, and she says other. It gets a little bit into her family dynamics, some problems and some issues. The book has been called Anne's most autobiographical novel. I don't think that's strictly true. There are certainly resemblances between Anne's life and this book. You should not read this book thinking that you're going to get, some tidbits or whatever about Anne's personal life. There are some resemblances, but the book is very much a work of art that stands on its own. But she and Stefan comes to basically revel in Triana's grief. And Triana had been a frustrated violinist in her youth, in her growing up years, and was not able to fulfill her dream of being a successful violinist. And Stefan's violin is basically a magical violin, and a tug of war, kind of psychic, operatic-like tug of war commences between Triana and the ghost Stefan, and she begins to resist him. And throughout the course of the book, I guess you would say a power play. That's not quite the right expression, but it evolves and changes over the course of the book, and she kind of gains the upper hand. She gets his violin from him. She is able to play magnificently. She becomes successful. The story moves from New Orleans to Vienna. Stefan takes her time traveling back to his time to see periods of his life, to see Beethoven in the past. Anne was quite, I believe this was the time, Anne was quite obsessed with Beethoven. She had seen the Gary Oldman movie, Immortal Beloved, and I believe that was quite one of the big inspirations for the writing of this book. And if you watch that wonderful movie, you can see why it's a very fine film. And the ghost of Beethoven makes an appearance in the book, and at the end there's a kind of, I won't give it away, but there is a kind of acceptance and a there's epiphanies on Stefan's part, on Triana's part. It's a compelling read, a beautifully written book, and I just find it utterly fascinating. I've dealt with my own frustrations over art I've wanted to create during my life, my own depressions, just like probably most of us have at one time or other, and so I had a very deep love. I've always had a very deep love and identification with this book, and I've never quite understood why some movie makers have not pounced on this. I guess it's all right for me to tell this. Ann told me one time that there was talk of Francis Ford Coppola doing a film of this, and it didn't, I won't get into it too much, but it didn't happen. I think her son, Christopher, one of the first things he wrote was a screenplay for this, of this book, and this has not been produced, but Plum Rowe, for a middle-aged or older actress out here to play Triana in a film or perhaps a television movie. I think Isabelle Huppert would be superb. And I don't know if Hollywood is really the right place for this particular book, and maybe for a lot of Anne's books too, be filmed. I think there is a European sensibility about a lot of Anne's works that perhaps filmmakers in Europe and other countries, I think, could exploit. We don't really have Viscontis now, and some of the great directors, Bertolucci. I think I don't know if he could now, but I think he could at one time have filmed this. But somebody, a very serious director, wonderful middle-aged or older actress to play Triana. There's any number of great actresses who could play this role and bring it to screen. So I don't understand why that hasn't happened. One of you great actresses out there, latch on to this. It's a great role for you. So, what else do I want to say on it? Violin, read it. You can get this book on Amazon or other sources extremely cheap, basically for the price of shipping. Do yourself a favor. Read this book. Do not overlook this book. Read it. And be sure and share with me in the comments below what is the book that you've read more times than any other book, and why. What is it about that book that keeps you coming back to it over and over again? So check out Violin by Anne Rice, and I know you'll love it. I promise you will. And I will speak to you again soon. Everyone, take care.